The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the bustling airport. Travelers hurried through the terminals, dragging suitcases, clutching coffee cups, and checking their phones for flight updates. Among the crowd was a young girl, no older than 16, standing nervously near the check-in counter. She was dressed simply, in a hoodie and jeans, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her dark skin and curly hair stood out in the sea of people, but she seemed to be trying her best to blend in, her eyes darting around as if she were waiting for someone. The girl had been standing there for a while, looking unsure of what to do next. She didn't have a ticket in her hand, and she wasn't in line like the other passengers. Instead, she lingered near the counter, occasionally glancing at the staff behind it. One of the airport employees, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, noticed her loitering and decided to approach her. "Excuse me," the staff member said, her tone sharp and impatient. "Do you have a ticket? You can't just stand here if you're not checking in." The girl looked up, startled. I'm waiting for my dad," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's coming to get me. He said he'd be here soon." The staff member frowned, clearly unconvinced. "This is a secure area. You can't wait here without a ticket. If your dad is coming, he can meet you outside. You need to leave." The girl's eyes widened in panic. "But he told me to wait here. He's on his way, I promise. Please, just a few more minutes." The staff member crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I'm sorry, but rules are rules. You can't stay here. If you don't leave, I'll have to call security." The girl's heart sank. She didn't know what to do. She had no money, no phone, and no way to contact her dad. She had been counting on him to show up, but now she was being forced to leave the one place he knew to find her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reluctantly turned and walked toward the exit, her shoulders slumped in defeat. As she stepped outside, the cool morning air hit her face, but it did little to ease her anxiety. She looked around, hoping to see her dad's familiar face, but there was no sign of him. She felt utterly alone, surrounded by strangers who didn't seem to notice her. She found a bench nearby and sat down, clutching her backpack tightly, trying to hold back her tears. Minutes passed, and the girl grew more and more anxious. She didn't know how long she could wait out here. She didn't even know if her dad was coming at all. What if something had happened to him? What if he had forgotten about her? The thoughts swirled in her mind, making her feel even more helpless. Back inside the airport, the staff member who had expelled the girl returned to her duties, seemingly unaffected by the encounter. She had dealt with countless passengers before, and this was just another routine day for her. But something about the girl's desperate plea had lingered in the back of her mind, though she quickly pushed it aside. Rules were rules, after all, and she had a job to do. Meanwhile, the girl continued to wait outside, her hope dwindling with each passing minute. She thought about going back inside to try again, but she was too scared of being turned away or, worse, getting into trouble. She felt trapped, with no one to turn to and no way to help herself. Just as she was about to give up, a loud voice called out from behind her. "There you are." The girl turned around, her heart leaping with relief. It was her dad, finally here. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a kind face, though at the moment, he looked more worried than anything else. He rushed over to her, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with guilt. "There was an accident on the highway, and I got stuck in traffic. I tried to call, but my phone died. Are you okay?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was so scared," she whispered. "They made me leave the airport. I didn't know what to do." Her dad's expression darkened as he listened to her story. He held her at arm's length, looking her over as if to make sure she was really okay. Then, without a word, he took her hand and led her back toward the airport entrance. Inside, the same staff member who had expelled the girl was still at the counter, helping another passenger. She didn't notice the girl and her dad approaching until they were right in front of her. When she looked up and saw the girl, her eyes widened in surprise. "You again?" she said, her tone sharp. "I told you, you can't be here without a ticket." The girl's dad stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Is this how you treat a child?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "She was waiting for me, and you forced her to leave without even trying to help her?" The staff member hesitated, caught off guard by the man's intensity. "Sir, I was just following protocol. She was loitering in a secure area, and instead of showing a little compassion, you sent her out into the cold, alone and scared," the man interrupted. "Do you have any idea what could have happened to her?" The staff member opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked from the man to the girl, who was now standing quietly beside her dad, her eyes downcast. For the first time, the staff member seemed to realize the gravity of what she had done. The man didn't wait for a response. He turned to his daughter and gently guided her away from the counter, his arm around her shoulders. "Come on, sweetheart," he said softly. "Let's get you home." As they walked away, the staff member watched them go, a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had always prided herself on following the rules, but now she couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, she had gone too far. She had been so focused on doing her job that she had forgotten about the human element, the people behind the policies. The girl and her dad made their way through the airport, the tension slowly easing as they walked. The girl clung to her dad's hand, feeling safe for the first time in hours. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that as long as her dad was with her, everything would be okay. As for the staff member, she returned to her duties, but the encounter stayed with her. It was a reminder that sometimes, rules needed to be bent, especially when it came to helping someone in need. She vowed to be more mindful in the future, to remember that behind every passenger was a story, a life, a person who deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. And so, the day went on, the airport buzzing with activity as usual. But for those involved in this small, yet significant moment, nothing would ever be quite the same. The girl and her dad walked through the airport, the earlier tension slowly melting away. The girl kept glancing up at her father, her small hand gripping his tightly, as if afraid he might disappear again. Her dad, on the other hand, was deep in thought, his jaw clenched as he replayed the events in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of his daughter sitting alone outside, scared and helpless, because someone had decided to follow the rules without a shred of empathy. "Are you really okay?" he asked her again, his voice softer now. He stopped walking and crouched down to her level, his hands on her shoulders. "You're not hurt, are you? Did anyone say anything else to you?" The girl shook her head, her curly hair bouncing slightly. "No, I'm okay," she said quietly. "I was just, really scared. I didn't know where you were, and I didn't know what to do." Her dad sighed, pulling her into another hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have been here sooner. I promise, I'll never let that happen again." They stood like that for a moment, the noise of the airport fading into the background. For the girl, it felt like the world had finally stopped spinning. She had her dad back, and that was all that mattered. But for her father, the situation wasn't over. He couldn't just let it go. What if something worse had happened to her while she was waiting outside? What if she had been approached by someone with bad intentions? The thought made his blood boil. "Come on," he said, standing up and taking her hand again. "Let's get your ticket sorted and get you home. But first, I need to take care of something." The girl looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Her dad gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it. Just trust me, okay?" They made their way to the airline's customer service desk, where a young man in a crisp uniform was assisting passengers. The girl's dad stepped up to the counter, his demeanor calm but firm. The girl stayed close to him, her eyes darting around nervously. "Good morning," the dad said, his voice steady. "I need to speak with a manager, please." The young man behind the counter blinked, caught off guard by the direct request. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" "I appreciate that," the dad replied, "but this is something that needs to be handled by a manager. It's important." The young man hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course, sir. Let me get someone for you." As they waited, the girl tugged on her dad's sleeve. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I'm making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," he said simply. "What that woman did to you wasn't right, and someone needs to know about it." The girl bit her lip, unsure how to feel. She didn't want to cause trouble, but at the same time, she trusted her dad. If he said this was important, then it must be. A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman in a tailored suit approached the counter. She had a polite smile on her face, but her eyes were sharp and observant. "Good morning, sir. I'm the manager on duty. How can I assist you?" The girl's dad took a deep breath, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "I'd like to report an incident that happened earlier this morning involving one of your staff members and my daughter." He gestured to the girl, who was now hiding slightly behind him, her face half buried in his side. The manager's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced at the girl before nodding. "Of course, sir. Please, tell me what happened." The dad recounted the events, keeping his explanation clear and concise. He described how his daughter had been waiting for him, how she had been forced to leave the airport despite explaining her situation, and how she had been left outside, scared and alone. As he spoke, the manager's expression grew more serious, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine concern. "I understand," she said when he finished. "I'm truly sorry for what happened. That's not the kind of experience we want any of our passengers to have, especially a child. I'll look into this immediately and ensure that the staff member involved is reminded of our policies regarding customer care and compassion." The dad nodded, but he wasn't done yet. "I appreciate that, but I think this goes beyond just a reminder. What happened to my daughter could have ended very differently. She was vulnerable, and instead of helping her, your employee chose to enforce a rule without considering the circumstances. That's not just a lapse in judgment, it's a failure to prioritize the safety and well-being of your passengers." The manager listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "You're absolutely right, sir. I'll make sure this is addressed at a higher level. We take these matters very seriously, and I assure you, steps will be taken to prevent something like this from happening again." The dad studied her for a moment, as if gauging her sincerity. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you. I hope you'll understand why I felt the need to bring this to your attention." "Of course," the manager said. "And again, I'm deeply sorry for what your daughter went through. If there's anything else we can do to make this right, please don't hesitate to let me know." The dad glanced down at his daughter, who was now peeking out from behind him. "I think we're okay now," he said. "But I'll be keeping an eye on how this is handled." With that, he took his daughter's hand and led her away from the counter. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with admiration. "You're really brave, Dad," she said softly. He chuckled, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Not brave, sweetheart. Just doing what any dad would do." As they walked toward their gate, the girl felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt before. Her dad had stood up for her, not just as his daughter, but as someone who deserved to be treated with kindness and respect. And for the first time that day, she felt like everything was going to be okay. As the girl and her dad approached the security checkpoint, the atmosphere around them seemed lighter. The girl was still holding her dad's hand, but her steps were more confident now, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Her dad, however, was still processing everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the thought of what might have gone wrong if he hadn't shown up when he did. The airport was a busy place, and his daughter was just a kid, vulnerable and alone. The idea that someone had turned her away without a second thought still made his stomach churn. They joined the line for security, the girl glancing around at the other travelers. Some were chatting, others were focused on their phones, and a few looked as tired as she felt. She wondered if any of them had ever been in a situation like hers, where they felt small and invisible. She hoped not. Her dad noticed her looking around and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded. "Yeah. I'm just thinking." "About what happened?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "Kind of," she admitted. "But also about what you said to that manager. You didn't yell or get mad. You just told her what happened. And she listened." Her dad smiled faintly. "Sometimes, you don't need to yell to make people understand. You just have to speak clearly and stand your ground. That's how you make sure your voice is heard." The girl thought about that for a moment, her small face scrunching up in concentration. "Do you think they'll really do something about it? Like, make sure it doesn't happen again?" "I hope so," her dad said. "But if they don't, we'll keep speaking up. That's how things change, by not staying silent." The girl nodded, her admiration for her dad growing even more. She had always known he was strong, but now she saw a different kind of strength in him, one that wasn't about being loud or angry, but about being firm and fair. It made her feel safe in a way she couldn't quite put into words. When it was their turn to go through security, the girl followed her dad's lead, placing her backpack on the conveyor belt and stepping through the metal detector. As they collected their belongings on the other side, she noticed a familiar face nearby. It was the staff member who had made her leave earlier. The woman was standing by one of the gates, talking to a colleague, her expression as stern as ever. The girl froze, her heart skipping a beat. She tugged on her dad's sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's her. The lady who made me leave." Her dad followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized the woman. For a moment, he seemed to consider whether to approach her, but then he shook his head. "Let's keep moving," he said quietly. "We've already done what we needed to do. It's up to the airport to handle the rest." The girl hesitated, her eyes still on the staff member. Part of her wanted to say something, to let the woman know how much she had hurt her. But another part of her, the part that trusted her dad, knew that sometimes, walking away was the stronger choice. As they walked toward their gate, the girl couldn't help but glance back one last time. The staff member was still there, her back turned, completely unaware of the impact she had had on a young girl's morning. The girl wondered if the woman would ever realize what she had done, if she would ever think about the scared kid she had sent outside without a second thought. Her dad noticed her looking back and gently guided her forward. "Don't worry about her," he said. "What matters is that you're safe now, and we're together. That's all that counts." The girl nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. She knew he was right, but she couldn't help feeling a small pang of sadness for the woman. Maybe she didn't mean to be unkind. Maybe she was just having a bad day. Or maybe she didn't realize how much her words and actions could hurt someone. Whatever the reason, the girl hoped that one day, the woman would understand the importance of kindness, not just as a rule, but as a way of being. As they reached their gate and found a place to sit, the girl leaned against her dad, her earlier exhaustion catching up to her. She closed her eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, and for the first time that day, she felt truly at peace. Whatever happened next, she knew her dad would be there to protect her, to stand up for her, and to remind her that she mattered. The gate area was quieter now, with only a handful of passengers waiting for the next flight. The girl and her dad found a pair of seats near the window, where they could watch the planes taxiing on the runway. The girl leaned her head against her dad's shoulder, her eyelids heavy but her mind still racing. She couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened, the fear, the loneliness, and then the relief of seeing her dad. It felt like a whirlwind, and she wasn't sure how to process it all. Her dad seemed to sense her unease. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer. "You've had a long morning," he said softly. "Try to rest a little. We've got some time before the flight." The girl nodded, but she didn't close her eyes. Instead, she stared out at the planes, her thoughts still swirling. "Dad?" she asked after a moment, her voice small. "Yeah, sweetheart? Do you think people like that lady ever change? Like, do they ever realize they're being mean?" Her dad was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Sometimes they do," he said finally. "But sometimes they don't. People can get so caught up in their own world, in their rules and routines, that they forget to see the people around them. It's not an excuse, but it happens." The girl frowned, her brow furrowing. "But that's not fair. Why should they get to be mean just because they're having a bad day or whatever?" "It's not fair," her dad agreed. "But here's the thing, you can't control how other people act. You can only control how you respond. And the best thing you can do is to not let their negativity change who you are. Be kind, even when others aren't. That's how you make the world a little better." The girl thought about that, her gaze drifting back to the window. She wasn't sure if she could be that strong, to stay kind even when people were unfair. But she wanted to try. She wanted to be like her dad, calm, firm, and always standing up for what was right. As they sat there, the gate area began to fill up with more passengers. The girl noticed a family with 2 young children struggling to keep them entertained, and an elderly couple helping each other with their bags. It reminded her that everyone had their own struggles, their own stories. Maybe the staff member who had been so harsh with her was dealing with something too. It didn't make what she did okay, but it made the girl feel a little less angry. Her dad noticed her watching the other passengers and smiled. "See all these people," he said. "They've all got their own stuff going on. Some are happy, some are stressed, some are just trying to get through the day. But at the end of it, we're all just people. And if we can remember that, it's easier to be kind." The girl nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I guess so." Her dad ruffled her hair affectionately. "You're a good kid, you know that. I'm proud of you." The girl's smile widened, and she finally let herself relax against him. For the first time that day, she felt like she could breathe. The fear and uncertainty were still there, lingering in the back of her mind, but they didn't feel as overwhelming anymore. She had her dad, and she had his words to hold on to. And for now, that was enough. The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, and the girl and her dad stood up, joining the line of passengers waiting to get on the plane. The girl clutched her backpack tightly, her earlier nervousness creeping back in. Flying always made her a little anxious, but after everything that had happened that morning, she felt even more on edge. Her dad noticed her tense shoulders and gave her a reassuring smile. "You'll be fine," he said. "Just think of it like a bus ride, but higher up. And once we're in the air, you'll get to see the clouds up close. That's always pretty cool, right?" The girl nodded, but her grip on her backpack didn't loosen. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her dad crouched down to her level, his eyes steady and calm. "Nothing's going to go wrong," he said firmly. "But even if it did, I'm right here with you. We'll handle it together, just like we always do." His words helped, but the girl still felt a knot of worry in her stomach as they handed their tickets to the flight attendant and stepped onto the plane. The narrow aisle and the rows of seats felt both familiar and intimidating. She followed her dad to their seats, sliding into the window seat while he took the aisle. She liked being by the window. It gave her something to focus on, something to distract her from the noise and the crowds. As the plane began to fill up, the girl watched the other passengers finding their seats. There was a man in a suit typing furiously on his laptop, a woman with a baby struggling to keep the child calm, and a group of teenagers laughing and joking with each other. It was strange, she thought, how everyone seemed so wrapped up in their own little worlds. No one seemed to notice her or her dad, or the quiet tension she was feeling. Her dad must have sensed her unease because he reached over and took her hand. "You're doing great," he said. "Just focus on the window. Once we're up in the air, you'll see how amazing it is." The girl nodded, her eyes fixed on the tarmac outside. She could see the ground crew moving around, loading luggage and directing planes. It was fascinating, in a way, to see how everything worked behind the scenes. It made her feel a little less small, a little less insignificant. When the plane finally began to taxi down the runway, the girl's heart started to race. She gripped her dad's hand tighter, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "It's okay," her dad said, his voice calm and steady. "Just breathe. You've got this." The girl closed her eyes as the plane lifted off the ground, the sensation of rising making her stomach drop. But then, slowly, she opened her eyes again and looked out the window. The ground was falling away, the cars and buildings shrinking into tiny dots. And then, as the plane climbed higher, they broke through the clouds, and the world outside turned into a sea of white and gold, the sun shining brightly above them. The girl's breath caught in her throat. It was beautiful, more beautiful than she had imagined. The clouds looked like a soft, fluffy blanket, stretching out as far as she could see. For the first time that day, she felt a sense of wonder, a feeling that pushed aside her fear and anxiety. "See?" her dad said, smiling at her reaction. "Told you it would be cool." The girl nodded, her eyes still glued to the window. "It's amazing," she whispered. Her dad leaned back in his seat, his hand still holding hers. "Sometimes," he said, "you just have to get through the hard parts to see the good stuff. And trust me, the good stuff is worth it." The girl didn't say anything, but she knew he was right. The morning had been hard, really hard, but now, sitting there with her dad, watching the world from above, she felt like she could breathe again. The fear and the worry were still there, but they didn't feel as big anymore. They felt manageable, like something she could handle. And for the first time that day, she felt a little bit brave. As the plane leveled off, the girl finally let go of her dad's hand, though she kept her eyes fixed on the window. The clouds stretched out endlessly, like a dreamy landscape she could almost step into. She felt a strange sense of calm now, as if the world below, and all the chaos of the morning, was far behind her. For a little while, at least, she could just be here, in this moment, with her dad. Her dad, meanwhile, was flipping through the in-flight magazine, though he kept glancing at her to make sure she was okay. He could see the tension slowly leaving her shoulders, and it made him smile. She was stronger than she realized, his daughter. She had been through a lot that day, but here she was, finding peace in the simple beauty of the sky. After a while, the flight attendant came by with a cart, offering drinks and snacks. The girl hesitated, unsure of what to choose, but her dad nudged her gently. "Go ahead," he said. "Pick something you like. You deserve a treat after the morning you've had." The girl smiled shyly and pointed to a small pack of cookies. The flight attendant handed them to her with a warm smile, and the girl murmured a quiet, "Thank you." It was a small gesture, but it made her feel seen, like she wasn't just some invisible kid anymore. As she nibbled on the cookies, her dad leaned over and said, "You know, you handled everything today really well. I know it was scary, but you stayed calm and did your best. That's not easy to do." The girl looked up at him, surprised. I didn't feel calm, she admitted. I felt really scared. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, her dad said. It means you keep going even when you are. And that's exactly what you did. The girl thought about that for a moment, her cookie halfway to her mouth. She had never really considered herself brave before. But maybe her dad was right. Maybe bravery wasn't about being fearless, it was about facing the fear and not letting it stop you. The rest of the flight passed quietly. The girl alternated between looking out the window and flipping through the magazine her dad had been reading. She even dozed off for a little while, her head resting against the seat. When she woke up, the plane was beginning its descent, and the clouds outside were starting to break apart, revealing patches of land below. As the plane touched down, the girl felt a mix of relief and excitement. They were finally here, wherever here was. She hadn't even asked her dad where they were going, she had been too caught up in everything else. But now, as they taxied to the gate, she turned to him and asked, "Where are we, Dad?" He grinned, clearly pleased she had finally asked. "We're visiting your grandma," he said. "She's been asking to see you for months, and I thought it would be a nice surprise." The girl's eyes lit up. She loved her grandma. Her house always smelled like cookies, and she told the best stories. The thought of seeing her made the girl forget all about the stressful morning. Suddenly, she couldn't wait to get off the plane. As they gathered their things and joined the line of passengers exiting the plane, the girl felt a renewed sense of energy. The day had started off rough, but now it felt like it was full of possibilities. She had her dad by her side, and soon she'd see her grandma. Whatever had happened earlier didn't seem to matter as much anymore. Her dad noticed her change in mood and chuckled. "Feeling better?" he asked. The girl nodded, her smile wide. "Yeah. A lot better." "Good," he said, ruffling her hair. "Because the fun part's just starting." And with that, they stepped off the plane and into the bustling airport, ready for whatever came next. The airport they had landed in was smaller than the one they had left, but it was just as busy. The girl clung to her dad's hand as they navigated through the crowd, her eyes wide as she took in the new surroundings. The walls were lined with colorful posters advertising local attractions, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and baked goods. It felt different here, warmer, somehow, even though the air conditioning was just as strong. As they made their way to the baggage claim, the girl's excitement grew. She hadn't seen her grandma in almost a year, and she couldn't wait to give her a hug. Her grandma always made her feel special, like she was the most important person in the world. After the morning she'd had, that was exactly what she needed. Her dad noticed her bouncing on her toes and laughed. "Someone's excited," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I can't help it," the girl replied, grinning. "Grandma's the best." "She is," her dad agreed. "And she's going to be so happy to see you." When they reached the baggage claim, they didn't have to wait long for their suitcases to appear. The girl's dad grabbed them off the carousel, and they headed toward the exit. As they stepped outside, the warm afternoon sun hit their faces, and the girl took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. "Over here," a familiar voice called out. The girl turned and saw her grandma waving enthusiastically from a nearby parking spot. She was standing beside an old, slightly rusty car, her silver hair catching the sunlight. The girl's heart leaped, and she let go of her dad's hand, running toward her grandma as fast as she could. "Grandma," she shouted, throwing her arms around the older woman. "Oh, my sweet girl," her grandma said, hugging her tightly. "Look how much you've grown. I've missed you so much." The girl buried her face in her grandma's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla. It felt like home. "I missed you too," she said, her voice muffled. Her dad caught up a moment later, carrying their suitcases. "Hey, Mom," he said, setting the bags down to give her a hug. thanks for picking us up. Of course, her grandma said, pulling back to look at him. You know I'd do anything for my favorite people. Now, let's get you two home. I've got a fresh batch of cookies waiting, and I want to hear all about your trip. The girl's eyes lit up at the mention of cookies, and she climbed into the back seat of the car, buckling herself in. Her dad loaded their suitcases into the trunk and slid into the passenger seat, while her grandma took the wheel. As they pulled out of the parking lot, the girl leaned forward, eager to talk. Grandma, you won't believe what happened this morning, she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. There was this lady at the airport, and she was really mean, and she made me leave, and I didn't know what to do, but then Dad showed up, and he... Whoa, her grandma interrupted, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Slow down, sweetheart. Start from the beginning. The girl took a deep breath and began again, this time telling the story more slowly. Her grandma listened intently, her expression growing more and more concerned as the girl described being forced to wait outside alone. When the girl finished, her grandma shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. I can't believe someone would treat a child like that, she said, her voice firm. You must have been so scared. I was, the girl admitted. But Dad fixed it. He talked to the manager and everything. Her grandma glanced at her dad, her eyes softening. You've always been good at standing up for what's right, she said. I'm proud of you. Her dad shrugged, looking a little embarrassed. I just did what any parent would do. Not every parent, her grandma said. But I'm glad you were there for her. The rest of the drive passed quickly, with the girl chattering away about everything she had seen and done that day. Her grandma listened patiently, interjecting with questions and comments that made the girl feel like her story mattered. By the time they pulled into the driveway of her grandma's cozy little house, the girl felt like the morning's events were finally behind her. As they stepped inside, the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air, and the girl felt a wave of comfort wash over her. This was her safe place, where nothing bad could happen. Her grandma handed her a cookie, still warm from the oven, and the girl took a bite, savoring the sweetness. Thank you, Grandma, she said, her mouth full. You're welcome, sweetheart, her grandma replied, smiling. Now, why don't you tell me more about that plane ride? Did you see any clouds? The girl nodded eagerly, launching into a detailed description of the view from the window. As she talked, she felt the last of her worries melt away. She was here, with her dad and her grandma, and everything was going to be okay. The afternoon at her grandma's house passed in a blur of laughter, stories, and, of course, more cookies. The girl felt like she was in a different world, one where the morning's troubles didn't exist. Her grandma had a way of making everything feel better, whether it was with her warm hugs, her endless supply of treats, or her ability to listen like no one else could. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the living room, the girl found herself curled up on the couch with her grandma, a cozy blanket draped over them. Her dad was in the kitchen, washing the dishes from dinner, and the sound of clinking plates and running water was oddly comforting. The girl felt safe here, surrounded by the people who loved her most. Grandma, the girl said after a while, her voice quiet, do you think people can change? Like, the lady at the airport, do you think she'll ever realize she was wrong? Her grandma was silent for a moment, her fingers gently stroking the girl's hair. That's a big question, she said finally. People can change, but it's not always easy. Sometimes, it takes something big to make them see things differently. And sometimes, well, sometimes they don't change at all. But that doesn't mean you stop trying to be kind. Kindness is like a seed, you plant it, and even if it doesn't grow right away, it might someday. The girl thought about that, her brow furrowing. But what if they're just mean forever? What's the point of being kind then? Her grandma smiled softly. The point is that being kind makes you a better person. It's not about them, it's about you. When you're kind, even when it's hard, you're showing the world who you are. And that's something no one can take away from you. The girl nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She liked the idea of kindness being a seed. It made her feel like even small actions could make a difference, even if she didn't see it right away. "You're really wise, Grandma," she said after a moment, her voice filled with admiration. Her grandma chuckled. "Oh, I don't know about that. I've just lived a long time and made a lot of mistakes. But if I can help you avoid some of them, then I've done my job." The girl smiled, snuggling closer to her grandma. She loved moments like this, when it felt like the world slowed down and it was just the two of them, talking about life. It made her feel grown up, like her thoughts and questions mattered. After a while, her dad came into the living room, drying his hands on a dish towel. "What are you two talking about in here?" he asked, his tone light and teasing. "Just life," her grandma said, smiling up at him. "Your daughter here has some big questions." "Oh, I'm sure she does," her dad said, sitting down in the armchair across from them. "She's always been a thinker." The girl felt a warm glow of pride at his words. She liked that her dad saw her as someone who thought about things, even if it sometimes made her head hurt. "We were talking about the lady at the airport," she explained. "Grandma said people can change, but even if they don't, it's still important to be kind." Her dad nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's good advice," he said. "And you know what? I think you're already pretty good at being kind. You've got a big heart, kiddo. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like that's a bad thing." The girl smiled, her cheeks turning pink. She wasn't used to getting compliments like that, but it felt nice. It made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was doing something right. As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, funny stories from her dad's childhood, plans for the next few days, and even a debate about the best kind of cookie. Her grandma insisted it was oatmeal raisin, while the girl argued for chocolate chip. The girl laughed until her sides hurt, and for the first time that day, she felt completely at ease. When it was finally time for bed, her grandma tucked her in with the same care she had when the girl was little. She smoothed the blankets, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Sleep tight, sweetheart. Tomorrow's a new day." The girl closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the day finally lift. She had been scared, she had been angry, and she had been sad. But now, lying in her grandma's guest room, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the house settling for the night, she felt something else: hope. Hope that things could get better, that people could change, and that kindness really did matter. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about what her dad and grandma had said. They were right. She couldn't control how other people acted, but she could control how she responded. And no matter what, she was going to try to be kind. Not because it was easy, but because it was who she wanted to be. And with that thought, she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, ready to face whatever the next day might bring. The next morning, the girl woke up to the smell of pancakes and the sound of her grandma humming in the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. For a moment, she just lay there, savoring the peacefulness. The events of the previous day felt like a distant memory, something that had happened to someone else. Here, in her grandma's house, the world felt safe and full of possibilities. She got out of bed and padded down the hallway, following the delicious smells. Her grandma was at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease, while her dad sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. He looked up when she walked in and smiled. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said. "You're just in time for breakfast." The girl slid into a chair, her stomach growling at the sight of the stack of pancakes on the table. Her grandma turned around, holding a plate with a perfectly golden pancake on it. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said, setting the plate in front of the girl. "Eat up. We've got a big day ahead." The girl didn't need to be told twice. She drizzled syrup over her pancake and took a big bite, savoring the sweet, buttery flavor. "What are we doing today?" she asked between bites. Her grandma sat down at the table, her own plate in hand. "I thought we could go to the park," she said. "There's a farmer's market there on Saturdays, and they've got all kinds of fun things to see. Plus, it's a beautiful day to be outside." The girl's eyes lit up. She loved farmers' markets. There was always so much to see, colorful fruits and vegetables, handmade crafts, and sometimes even live music. It sounded like the perfect way to spend the day. After breakfast, they got ready to go. The girl put on her favorite sweater, and her grandma handed her a sun hat to keep the bright morning sun out of her eyes. As they stepped outside, the girl took a deep breath, enjoying the crisp, fresh air. The sky was a brilliant blue, with just a few fluffy clouds drifting by. It felt like the kind of day where anything could happen. The park was only a short drive away, and when they arrived, it was already bustling with activity. Stalls lined the pathways, selling everything from fresh produce to handmade jewelry. The girl's grandma took her hand, leading her through the market with a sense of purpose. They stopped at a stall selling homemade jam, and the girl's eyes widened at the array of flavors: strawberry, peach, even lavender. "Pick one," her grandma said, smiling. "My treat." The girl hesitated for a moment before pointing to a jar of raspberry jam. "This one," she said. "It looks good." Her grandma handed the vendor some money and tucked the jar into her bag. "Good choice," she said. "We'll have this on toast tomorrow morning." As they continued through the market, the girl felt a sense of joy she hadn't felt in a long time. The colors, the smells, the sounds, it was all so alive, so full of energy. She stopped to listen to a man playing guitar, his music filling the air with a cheerful melody. Her dad tossed a few coins into the man's guitar case, and the girl smiled, feeling proud of him. After a while, they found a bench in the shade and sat down to rest. The girl leaned against her dad, watching the people pass by. She saw families with young children, couples holding hands, and even a group of teenagers laughing and taking selfies. It reminded her that the world was full of all kinds of people, each with their own stories and struggles. "You know," her dad said after a while, "I'm really proud of you. You've been through a lot, but you've handled it like a champ." The girl looked up at him, surprised. "Really?" "Really," he said, ruffling her hair. "You're stronger than you think, kiddo. And no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." The girl felt a lump form in her throat, but she didn't cry. Instead, she smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had her dad, her grandma, and a whole world full of possibilities ahead of her. Whatever challenges came her way, she knew she could face them. As they sat there, watching the world go by, the girl felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The morning's troubles were behind her, and the future was wide open. She didn't know what it would bring, but she knew one thing for sure: she was ready for it. And with that thought, she leaned back against her dad, feeling the sun on her face and the love of her family all around her. It was a perfect moment, one she knew she would carry with her for a long, long time.